Welcome and thank you for joining today's New Nature Artist and Scientist Talk, a conversation with Jenna Sutela, with Markus Buehler and Stefanie Hessler. My name is Tatjana Braun and I'm a program curator at the Goethe-Institut in Montreal. The conversation today is part of our public program around New Nature, which is a series of encounters between leading climate scientists, artists, filmmakers, technologists, and immersive creators from Germany, Canada, Mexico, and the United States. We kicked off this exchange in May with an online conference, a keynote talk with Leanne Beta-Samosake-Simpson, moderated by Ian Mauro, as well as an artist talk with Nerea Calvillo and Nick Shapiro that I invite you to rewatch online on our website and our YouTube channel. Over the course of the last months, we continued this exchange that we started in May by presenting a range of programs such as discussions, film screenings, and many more. This talk will also be recorded. And to share and or rewatch this talk, as well as all New Nature public talks that happened over the last months, I invite you to check out our website and social channels or just follow the hashtag New Nature 2020. About New Nature quickly. It is an initiative by the Goethe-Institut realized with the support of the Federal Foreign Office of Germany and in collaboration with different international organizations. And today I would like to take this opportunity and thank our partners for their involvement in creative inputs, amongst others, Retune Creative Technology Platform, the Museum of the Moving Image, the National Film Board of Canada, the Centre Phi in Montreal, Milieu Institute at Concordia University, Massive Science, XR Bavaria, and Union Dog Center for Documentary Art that are running the show backstage today. And now I would like to hand over to the New Nature Principal Curator, Canadian documentary filmmaker and independent curator Samara Chadwick, and New Nature co-curator Sandra Teitke in Berlin, who will give a brief introduction to the program and most importantly, present our speakers today. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Tatjana. I'm calling in from Mi'kma'ki, which is the ancestral lands of the Mi'kmaq peoples, which is also known as Nova Scotia, Canada. I invite you all to check out this beautiful resource. It's called nativeland.ca. I'll share it in the chat. It's a map in which you can research the histories and the treaties that exist within the land that you're calling from today. And it's an interesting way of exploring kind of the ancestral stewardship of that land, which ties into the theme of New Nature because the project itself, which has been running all year, in a very interesting year to launch such a kind of ambitious project. But New Nature itself began kind of with a playful play on the concept of nature itself. And it began with an assertion that really all the traditional or so-called traditional forms of representing and managing, containing, and even relating to the natural world or the non-human world have led us to this acute climate crisis. And so by traditional, I mean, as we know, these kind of patriarchal, colonial, capitalist systems, even silos of scientific thought that have fallen short in really truly encompassing the ways that we can engage with the complexity of the human and non-human worlds and how they're really all intertwined. And so we've been very much inspired by the ideas of entanglement, and therefore have invited all of these professionals whose fields would normally not overlap to engage with one another. And so that involves both scientists as well as contemporary artists and technologists from these four countries that Tatjana mentioned, Canada, the United States, Mexico, and Germany, to really come together and explore how the intersection and the overlap of their fields of interest can open up new imaginaries, new ideas for what immersion looks like, and also invoke other forms of knowledge that stand outside of kind of the corpus of natural knowledge. So that includes indigenous knowledge and stewardship, maternal knowledge and instincts, and animal and plant knowledge. And as Tatjana said, this began as kind of more of a formal exchange that involved a lot of travel originally, and it's since responded to the pandemic by becoming very much an online a series of online exchanges and possibilities for really connecting with work in new ways. There are still 2 public programs that are happening now, and so we invite you to participate. They're all free, and that includes a series of short films that are curated with Sonia Epstein at the Museum of the Moving Image. They're free and online until December 11th. And those are, I'll share the link in the chat. And there's also a series of projections in 3 major cities, which include Montreal, Berlin, and New York City. Sandra is live from our venue in Berlin. It's the closing night in Berlin. It's called New Nature Vitrine. It's still going to be happening in New York from December 15th until January 8th. And these are a series of beautiful works that engage in an interesting way, in a playful way. They subvert the tropes of the nature films by exploring scales and textures that are really beyond the human. So they're all free. Before I throw it over to Sandra in Berlin, I just wanted to let you know that this talk is going to be recorded and will be made available online. We invite you to put on headphones so you can kind of enjoy the immersive experience of the talk and the audio that will be shared. And there will be a Q&A. We really hope you can participate in this conversation as well. You can input your Q&A, your questions into the Q&A feature at the bottom of the screen. At any point during the conversation, you can just add a question and it will come to it towards the end of the talk. Or you'll also be able to unmute yourselves when we switch into the Q&A section in the last 15 minutes of the talk, and you can ask your question live as well. So I really want to thank Union Docs and especially Juan Pedro, who's the wizard of Zoom and who'll be managing all this. And thank you to Sandra, my co-curator, and live in Berlin. Thanks so much for all being here.
Yeah, thanks, Samara. Hi, everyone. So as Samara said, I'm in Berlin at a space called Goethe Berlin, which is the last of 3 exhibition spaces that we showed the works, or in vitrines we showed the works. You can see it in the background maybe a little bit, the vitrines of this particular space. And they each ran for 1 week in every space, and we kind of tried to be present in different neighborhoods in Berlin. So here we are in Schöneberg, for the ones of you who know Berlin. So there's the loop in the vitrine that goes towards the outside, and then there's also here inside the beautiful Joan Jonas works that you can see in the corner here. Yeah. So tonight we will, as everyone knows, hear the 3 speakers, and it will be moderated by Stefanie Hessler, who is a curator and writer, whose works focuses on ecologies, technology, and expanded notions of life and non-life. Amongst many, many other things, she is the curator of the 17th MOMENTA Biennale in Montreal that will happen next year. I think it was also postponed, titled Sensing Nature. And she's also the director of Kunsthall Trondheim in Norway, where she actually recently curated an exhibition with Jenna Sutela, one of the speakers of tonight, including the video work Nimiia, cétiï, that was also presented at the second venue here in Berlin at Feld 5, and which is based on Sutela's experiments with the Bacillus subtilis. A few days ago, actually, another show curated by Stefanie opened in Porto at the Galleria Municipal that presents works by the artist Diana Policarpo. It is entitled Nets of the Hyphae. And it focuses on the ergot parasite, which has been infecting ripe plants and in small doses has traditionally been used by women healers for abortions. So yeah, they're all, obviously focused on different details, but they're all everything that Stefanie organizes or that I'm aware of, and that also is relevant to this particular context, deals or happens at the intersection of art and science. So I would like to ask Stefanie what her particular interest is in this intersection, maybe also how she got interested in it, because she has been working also with Jenna and with Joan Jonas and with other artists that are part of the program of the New Nature Vitrines program. A lot of women, that work at this intersection of science and art. So yeah, I'm interested in what her interest is and how she came there. And I hand it over to Stefanie.
Thank you so much, Sandra, for the beautiful introduction and for the invitation also to Samara, to Tatiana and the Goethe-Institut. And thanks to JP for having us and for helping us make everything run as smoothly as possible. I'm very excited to be here today with Jenna Sutela and Markus Buehler. Jenna Sutela, as many of you may know, is an artist who works with sound, words, and other living media, for instance, bacteria and slime mold. She has an interest in biological and computational systems. Her recent work explores interspecies communication and aspires to connect with the world beyond our human consciousness. So, for instance, through machine learning, she has given a voice to Bacillus subtilis bacteria who thrive in the human microbiome and also in outer space. And we can talk more about that later today. And Markus Buehler is here with us today. Markus is a materials scientist and a composer of experimental music. He has developed a method for expressing molecular vibrations in audible space. And as part of a collaboration through the MIT Center for Art, Science and Technology, where Jenna is currently in residency, Markus and Jenna are experimenting with amplifying the waves of emotional molecules in everyday activities, and especially water will play an important role here. I'm particularly excited to be in this conversation today because of my own interest in water, among other things, and ecology, but also because we will be speaking about emotions and emotions, for instance, in Markus's work on emotional molecules, and in Jenna's work involving various non-human actors. And in my work as a curator, I've been pretty obsessed with sensing and sense making through other than the rational cognitive realm only. I think that emotions, affect, and different ways of sensing can inform our ways of thinking, and importantly also our ways of feeling. And I think that feeling and affect are particularly important at this moment of social and environmental upheaval, and to be able to consider social and environmental justice. Feeling is important to my way of thinking too, because it has been pushed aside very much in Western contexts as a legitimate way of knowing. And I'm particularly interested in how through the silos or through undoing silos that Samara mentioned earlier on, we can actually find ways of being more caring and relating more in more caring ways to one another. I'm also interested or currently working on affect and sex in relation to nature for an exhibition that we're developing here in Trondheim together with the Seedbox Environmental Humanities Collaboratory. The show will in fact be called Sex Ecologies and open in December next year. And also I had to think of Maria Puig de la Bella Casa and her book Matters of Care, in which she thinks about care not so much as a normative way of taking care of one another, but about relations. And I think these are some starting points that will guide our conversation today. We would start actually with Jenna telling us a bit more about how she and Markus met and what you're currently working on, and then we'll segue into an introduction by Markus and continue with a conversation. So I'll pass the word over to you, Jenna.
Thank you, Stefanie, for the introduction. Thank you, Samara and Sandra and Goethe-Institut for the invitation. And I look forward to the discussion in this great company with you, Stefanie and Markus. And yeah, I'll share a couple of my past projects just to give everyone an idea about my interests and approach and the way in which both organic and synthetic more than human life forms take part in the work, and also other humans. And I chose the projects that best fit together with what we're currently working on with Markus as part of my residency at the MIT Center for Art, Science and Technology. And these are also projects that are shown as part of the New Nature Vitrines program here in Berlin, where I'm calling from. I'll start with gut machine poetry. Juan Pedro, could you share the image? Yes, thank you. So ever since the Renaissance, the most complex machines that we've developed have been used as the analogy of the mind, but the human mind is intuitive and too complex an organism to formalize. For example, the head brain works together with the gut brain, and computers are by design deterministic. They follow set procedures. In my project, Gut Machine Poetry, the idea is to introduce entropic processes into computing via inserting fermenting foodstuff into the guts of the computer. I made a kind of a homebrew computer operated by a symbiotic colony of bacteria and yeast in a kombucha tea ferment and producing a new kind of language. I'm going to show you a video, a short excerpt of NamGut, the microbial breakdown of language, documenting this project. And what you'll be looking at is sort of a microbial poetry culture, so-called wetware random number generator, based on microscopic footage of a kombucha ferment connected to a series of letters. The stochastic movement of yeast eating sugar affects the jumbling of letters on the screen. And the letters are based on a text about code laws and the gut-brain connection. My interpretation of an ancient Sumerian incantation, or Namshap, dealing with universal language, and also featured in Neil Stephenson's Snow Crash. But the voice in the video is Jessica Edwards. Juan Pedro, could you play the video now?
E, 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 Ra, we, plop, ole, see, row, how, ow, whoa, ka. We ase edet au hide I. Pepe onue ye ris te e offer.
The word jumbling algorithm that's connected to the kombucha feed and crafted by Vincent de Belval takes after Jumbo, which is a program that cognitive scientist and AI researcher Douglas Hofstetter developed to solve anagrams based on the actions inside a biological cell. And in his experiment, letters are combined and broken apart by different types of enzymes that, as he describes, jiggle around, glomming onto structures where they find them, kicking reactions into gear. And Juan Pedro, the second image, please. So my more recent work continues in the footsteps of the Gut Machine Poetry project. Nimiia cétiï uses machine learning to generate a new written and spoken language based on a computer's interpretation of a Martian tongue from the late 1800s, originally channeled by the French medium Helen Smith, and now voiced by me, as well as the movement of Bacillus subtilis, an extremophilic bacterium that, according to recent spaceflight experimentation, can also survive on Mars. And this bacterium is used in the making of natto, for example. This is the type of fermented soybeans, which is a classic Japanese probiotic considered as a secret to long life. The machine in the Nimiia cétiï project is a medium channeling messages from entities that usually cannot speak. But the work is also about intelligent machines as sort of aliens of our creation. So I think there's an interesting link between the project of talking with aliens and the problem of talking with machines, because we build at least some of these aliens ourselves, and now the challenge is to understand the non-human condition of these machines as that work as our interlocutors and infrastructure. For example, the so-called black box problem in machine learning means that it's sometimes hard to explain how an AI has come to its conclusions. So I'll show another short video or a few clips of this project or this experiment in machine learning and interspecies communication. I worked on it together with engineers Memo Akten and Damien Andri, and the breathy sounds are played by Miago Klein in contrabass recorder and Shinjo Morgantini in flute. So we could watch the video now. What you saw in the video is a computer watching footage of the Bacillus subtilis bacteria under a microscope and generating a script or calligraphy based on an analysis of what it sees. So you could imagine a pen suspended from a long piece of string that's resting on paper that's slowly kind of sliding sideways, and raw force from the movements of the bacteria knocks the pen around, leaving marks on the paper. Audio interacts with the bacterial movements, and what you heard is the computer reorganizing or mimicking the early Martian language. A network trained on my voice looks at each frame of the video and produces a short block of sound that it thinks matches that frame or the configuration of bacteria in it. And another layer of sound, the so-called vocals, presents a more typical approach where the network simply generates more of what it has heard before. And in our forthcoming project with Markus, we're continuing in the realm of sonifying nanoscale phenomena. And having been listening to or trying to give a voice to bacteria before, I met Markus at the MIT and was instantly drawn to his SoundCloud channel where he's sharing some of his experiments on expressing molecular vibrations in audible space. And Markus will tell you more about his approach in detail. However, I had also been sensing some kind of a niche movement towards listening instead of looking when it comes to the scientific study of nanoscale life. The first glimpse of Markus and my collaboration will be out online in early 2021, or actually the first glimpse is tonight in some way, because Markus will later show an example of our process thus far. Basically, we're studying so-called emotional molecules, such as oxytocin, the love and bonding hormone, listening to the vibrations that they create within us, as well as in waters beyond those of the body. And the work is somewhat inspired by Masaru Emoto's controversial ideas about water as a kind of a blueprint for our reality and how different emotional energies can change its physical structure. Anyway, I'll let Markus continue from here, and we'll then join him and Stefanie in discussion afterwards.
Thank you. Thank you, Jenna. Great introduction and very inspiring. So what I'll do, I'll show just a few photos and movie clips to highlight a little bit about what I do and how we connected actually and what we're trying to do moving forward. So if you could please play the first movie. I work with molecules, and I use various computational methods to study the motion of molecules. And what you're going to see in a moment, can you play the first movie, please? Here we go. It's coming up. What you see here is the motion of a protein molecule. I study proteins, which are basically nature's building block of life. So if you think about your body, it's made from, it's not actually made from DNA, it's encoded by DNA, but proteins are actually the molecules that build your body and build all your organs and viruses and other things that we're dealing with right now. And if you look at a protein molecule, or any molecule for that matter, in a microscope, kind of like what Jenna showed earlier, this is would be a much higher magnification microscope. You can see the individual atoms, and they're not static. So if you open a chemistry book, if you go online and you search, show me a picture of the coronavirus or show me a picture of oxytocin, you're going to actually see a photo of it, maybe a molecular structure. But that's not how these things really look like. So these molecules are actually continuously moving and vibrating. And the reason why they do that is because of the quantum mechanical effects, essentially, that what we perceive as temperature. Everything in the world is warm, at least on this planet and with life. Most things are pretty warm, and so there's a lot of kinetic energy, we call it. So this kinetic energy is enough to actually deform the bonds. And if you think about a molecule like this as a vibrating object, you can very quickly make the connection to sound. And I'll talk more about that in a moment. If you could please show the second movie. So you can actually go inside these molecules and kind of go and elucidate the detailed motions of the particular regions in the molecule. This here is a movie that I put together recently on a study related to viruses. But the point of this is really, you can see that once you tweak out individual motions, individual frequencies, you can clearly see how the molecule isn't just a random collection of motions, it's actually a very organized movement. And so in a molecule like you've seen in the first movie, you can see many of these motions overlaid. And this reminds you sort of to a spectrum of a sound spectrum that you might hear. And the next photo, number 3, shows that. So you can actually create fingerprints, both vibrational fingerprints and audible fingerprints of different molecules. For instance, in this picture here, that is not related to the work we're doing together, which we're going to actually formally present in a couple of months. But this is work I've been currently involved in visualizing and inspecting and sonifying viruses. You can see that even small molecular changes like the coronavirus bound to the human cell and not bound to the human cell, which is sort of the moment of infection, leads to a very subtle but distinct difference in the spectrum. So you see that here on the screen as sort of a picture of all the different waves it generates, this molecule generates in that way. And in my lab, we've developed a methodology to actually make these vibrational spectra audible. And it works pretty similar to a string. You imagine plucking a string, right, and it will vibrate. These molecules do that too, except we don't need to pluck them because, as I mentioned earlier, the thermal energy, the kinetic energy in this world, room temperature, if you wish, or body temperature, is enough to actually really excite these molecules and make them render sound. So if we go to the next movie is actually going to show also an audio. We can use these kind of molecular motions as a basis for sound generation and create, if you wish, new musical instruments, new musical methods to create sound. So number 4 is, it's a movie and it has some sound. We're going to play maybe 20 or 30 seconds so you can hear that. So everything you hear here is generated by these building blocks of life. So as you, you can listen to the whole piece on SoundCloud or other places online. I think we're going to post the links later. So all you heard was generated by these protein molecules. So not conventional musical instruments, not conventional sound generation methods, but really listening to the quantum mechanical level of these motions. So it's really an interesting microscope to understand fundamental processes of life. Now, what I've been doing recently with this is to see whether we can not only visualize these motions in audible space, in other words, to hear them and understand how different proteins sound like, or how the infection process sounds like, or how mutations in a protein sound like, but also to maybe visualize these motions in a different medium. And that's actually how we got into water, because water is, as was mentioned in the beginning, universally important, and there's a lot of really interesting science and art and relationships between them that have been created. But water is also ultimately where these proteins live in. So if you you're going to see that at the very end of these couple of movies in the preview that Jenna and I worked on together, these protein molecules actually live in water. We are our bodies are, I think, 99% water. And proteins actually wouldn't exist the way they look like in these movies or in a microscope unless there was the majority of water around them. And so what I did is I could show up the next photo now. I've created a setup where I can utilize the sound wave representations of these proteins. And I actually have a smartphone, a little cell phone on the right-hand side. We have an app there too, but it could be any kind of sound source, could be your laptop, it could be, Zoom. You can feed that information, this audio signal relating to a particular protein of interest or proteins of interest, multiple proteins, multiple molecules, into an amplifier in a transducer. And this little circle in the middle, it's basically a petri dish that I spray painted and put a little water film in there. And you can see the little blue shimmering color in there. And there's a light source, so I can visualize these waves very clearly, and then take photos or movies or videos of these waves. So once you play the sound, water will be excited. And now these unique sounds, these spectra that you've seen earlier, kind of these timbres of instrumentation that represent each different molecule or mutation thereof, creates a very particular pattern of waves. And that's something that has been called somatic representation and others, but has a very practical way also of understanding how things vibrate, like bridges and cars and airplanes and engineering. So if we go to the next photo, number 6, it's more of a schematic engineering representation of the whole setup. Again, you have the sound source, the amplifier, the actuator, and the water film and the camera, and you get these patterns. So what you see on the right-hand side actually is a snapshot of one of those wave patterns. And so what I was curious about is whether, so I know already we can hear very distinctly how different proteins, different mutations sound like. We can listen to the ultimate biological nanoscale mechanisms of life and also machinery. So I think it was an interesting reference to crossing the barriers between human-made life or human-made machinery and natural machinery. At the nanoscale, they're basically indistinguishable because they follow the same kind of quantum chemical laws. But I was curious whether you can not only hear these differences, but also see them. And you can see one pattern here, but of course, we can do that easily for multiple molecules. And so the next movie, number 7, you're going to see, I think, 3 or 4 different molecules and what kind of water patterns they generate. And so you can see this is the first virus, MERS, that creates a very particular pattern. The next one is the SARS virus. And if you look closely and you inspect that, you can actually begin to see that each different protein, each different molecule, each different nanoscale object has a unique signature, not only in sound, but actually also in the representation of water waves. And I'm really intrigued, as Jenna also is, and I think many of us are, in transcending between different manifestations and advancing our understanding of how stuff works, how life works, how materials work, how we can design materials, how we can design proteins by using different representations, not only the immediate obvious visual one, but actually, like I did here, creating an audible representation and then using that to create a water representation. So I think we're going to move on to the next one, number 8. So this is the photo actually you've seen as an inset in the previous picture, but a little bit bigger. And you can see a lot of details here. So this is sort of a really detailed shot of one of those molecules and the kind of water waves they generate. And if you look closely, you're going to see that each of these molecules look a little bit different. Now, it's really hard for the human brain to understand that. So what we did is we trained a machine learning algorithm to understand these patterns. So what I did essentially, we took movies of many different molecules, have hundreds and thousands of different frames that collectively describe the unique signatures basically of each of these proteins, and then trained an AI algorithm to basically learn the features. So like Jenna said earlier, AI algorithms can learn things that maybe aren't as easy to learn for humans. They're unbiased as opposed to our own understanding of how things should look like if they're trained well. And so in this case, all the AI has ever seen in its lifetime, if you wish, are these patterns of water waves. So it becomes an expert in understanding how water waves generated by proteins, by molecules, look like and how to distinguish them. And so we've done this for, if you go to the next one, number 9, done this for a whole bunch of different molecules. These codes are basically reflections of different molecular structure in biology. You can see that the AI algorithm is very capable actually of just looking at an image and then determining which protein has actually caused this particular type of waterway formation. And then, of course, you want to think, what can we use this for? And the context that I look at this is the following. If I can see something now at the macroscopic level, I can see it with my eyes, I can look at it on a computer screen, that happens really at the nano level. Can I use this algorithm to determine whether similar patterns are found elsewhere in nature? So we already know that these patterns are found in water waves. So what I did, I used an algorithm that will take a look at the image and use the machine learning model and basically draw into the image, accentuates the features that it recognizes. It's sort of, if you begin to dream, right? Your dreams will spin off an idea or an event you had during the day, and it will create new kinds of ideas that are drawn basically along similar lines of what your experiences has been. And these dream algorithms, you can see it also in a way, if you take a piece of paper with a sketch of a picture, and you were supposed to draw into that picture, kind of like a coloring exercise. You will begin to draw something into the picture, things that come into your mind, things that you have seen, things you know. So the algorithm does something very similar. It dreams on these images. And on the next photo, number 10, you can see the water waves, and the algorithm now dreams on these water waves. And it's no surprise that the algorithm actually accentuates these features of water waves that it has learned, right? So this is sort of what it knows. That's the universe in which the model lives in. It can see the water waves, the patterns, the unique patterns of these particular proteins, and it will draw them in. So it kind of colors into this picture. This is a test case, if you wish, right? We expect this to happen. Now, what we can do also is to go, and this is where I think, Jenna and I are connecting in this future work, is if we go to another photo, the next one, number 12, 11, yeah, 11. It's a photo I took in Rockport, Mass. If you haven't been there, if you ever in Massachusetts, you should definitely check it out. It's a beautiful place here in the North Shore. And if you look at this, it's kind of an everyday photo. It has rocks, it has sky, it has ocean, coastline, a nice harbor. And the question then was, if I run this algorithm now, what kind of molecular vibrations does the algorithm see in there, right? So to us humans, I can look at this photo and I can begin to think the clouds look like, a tree, or the clouds might look like, and maybe some slime mold or something interesting. But that is our experience and our imagination. The AI can also have imagination. Its imagination is really only derived based on what it has learned, and all the AI knows are these protein waves in water representations. So when you run the algorithm, if you go to the next photo, number 12, you can kind of see how this AI now interprets this photo, and it tries to draw in things that reflect wave patterns that it sees in the image. And I can actually run the algorithm also to try to determine what kind of protein molecule, what kind of life molecule or emotional molecule has the AI seen in this everyday photo. And I won't, talk about this in more detail today, but stay tuned in the work that we're doing, and it's going to come out in the new year. So you can begin to see what kind of nanoscopic visualizations an everyday object contains. So you can take a face, you can take a photo of yourself, for instance, and kind of determine what kind of molecules does an algorithm see in a face, or in a cloud, or in a tree, or in a coastline. If you go to the next one, this can also be applied to really abstract images. So this actually is a spectrogram of one of my sound works, and what you see is kind of like how this spectrogram is a very technical representation. It's an abstract graph basically, and the algorithm will begin to draw in, and you actually see this movie evolving as it begins to dream deeper and deeper, and it evolves and creating this secret language of representations, this code that again we can read out at the end and determine what kind of molecular structures are in that particular representation of sound in a visual space, and a graphic analysis of that. And you can kind of see, if you watch this several times, the photo is really changing dramatically, right, from the initial picture to that final one, and it's almost unrecognizable and becomes something totally different, which then can be used for other inspiration. If we go to the next one, that's another example. Since when you this is actually a homemade graphics card that basically in the beginning you saw a typical breadboard design with computer chips. here the algorithm begins to dream on that. And what I find really fascinating is that, after a while, if you were to take a look at the final snapshot, you wouldn't necessarily believe or think or imagine this would be a breadboard computer, right? In the beginning it was. So it really shows the transformation. And it's absolutely fascinating, I think, to look at all sorts of photos and images and how they change. So the next one is, the last one is sort of a preview of the work that Jenna and I have been doing together in applying this algorithm to what we call emotional molecules. And maybe Jenna later will talk a little more about what they are. But what you see here is kind of a summary of all the different aspects. I try to go through step by step, and now in this movie, you're going to see them all come together. So in the beginning, in the last movie 15, you're going to see the water waves. So this is just another angle of these water vibrations, and they're caused by these emotional molecules. This is an inset of the actual movie of the protein. You can see these little. If you can stop the movie really quick, please, if possible. I just want to highlight in the beginning, in the inside here, you saw the molecule and the water molecules embedding it, right? So the little tiny thing in the middle was the actual, was the actual molecule, the thing in the middle. Surrounding this are all the water molecules. Like I said earlier, we consist to 99% or so of water, and without water, the protein wouldn't exist in its stable configuration. So we can continue with the movie, please. So it kind of shows how this nanoscopic object leads to these macroscopic water waves, and then being utilized. In a moment, you're going to see how that's applied to another biological organism, a jellyfish that Jenna videotaped. And this is a movie, and we've applied the algorithm now to each frame of the movie. So you can see that in a moment how this initial movie of this beating oscillatory motion of this living organism, a jellyfish, can be transformed. Now you see that the algorithm begins to dream on this, on not only on the video now, not only on the image, but on the video itself, begins to really jumble around the entire configuration and create this, really interesting new representation of what these nanoscopic objects look like now in the perspective of a new biological organism, the jellyfish in this case. With that, maybe, I don't know if Jenna probably wants to add a few things, maybe on the emotional aspect or the water programming idea. Give it over to you.
Hi. Yeah, so in that video, you actually saw the oxytocin, the love-or bonding hormone, and the other emotional molecules that we've been looking at are dopamine, serotonin, norepinephrine, and that can be used for maybe like, because we've been thinking about ways of amplifying these molecules, emotional molecules from within to the external world and to the domestic waters in particular, that you could use for different purposes. There's also been ATP for carrying energy, growth factor, enabling plasticity, and antibody for protection. So yeah, this is the menu of molecules. Should I talk a bit more about or should we go into the conversation mode, or?
I can ask you a question, if that's okay, because I'm really fascinated by the way that you, in working together and also in your individual work, give voice to other entities, be they human created or natural. And I'm thinking that there's a lot of conversations happening at the moment within the context of post-humanism, or involving more than humans in this kind of conversation. But a lot of those conversations focus on animals, flurry, or mostly like fluffy kind of animals that we can relate to in one way or the other. And yeah, and I'm thinking what you're doing is really going into other entities that we don't pay so much attention to otherwise, be they living or non-living. And I came to think of the gender studies researcher Mel White-Chen, who's been talking about the animacy of different entities in Western philosophy. So we think usually of the human at the sort of top of this hierarchy, followed by animals, followed by smaller entities such as bacteria, and then maybe vegetables, plants, rocks, and so on. But what you're looking at is really quite goes the normative. And I'm also thinking about other philosophers or thinkers such as Kunsthall Trondheim, the science and technology studies scholar, who from an indigenous perspective speaks about liveliness or life force and relations. And so what I'm wondering about is, in your work, and I heard this coming through in both of your talks, is giving a voice to something else. And I was wondering if you could talk a bit more about that, and maybe also the difficulty in giving a voice to something that is so tiny, or that exists at a nanoscale that we can't necessarily see with a bare eye.
I can start from answering. Basically, for some reason, I've been always curious about this very minuscule organisms, the sort of underground of life forms, and but then also for the reason that that a lot of these organisms and molecules are part of who we are. So I've been always really curious about this, like our like symbiotic form that consists of a lot of other forms of life and a lot of processes that are totally beyond us or our kind of cognitive capacities. And I think that has kind of led me to bacteria, then also now even smaller molecules. And I think also, I think this, because this project has really started to take shape during the pandemic, during the lockdown, and I feel there's something at a time when you can't go outside, you kind of tend to go inside and also feel these, or sort of sense these processes going on inside the body in a different way. It's quite an emotional time, and somehow it felt like the right type of focus for this time.
Yeah, I think, I mean, it was a great, great question, Stefanie. I think to me, if we want to go beyond the human, I was like human created distinctions of what life forms are and what actually is a life form, whether a rock is one or not. I think that, to me, when I look at these vibrational signatures, that really is really the ultimate scale of how, what we call matter can be described, and you can really see the indistinguishable nature between living and non-living objects. And and as you know, I mean, I in my research, I study how we can interface nature and technology, or human created materials and natural materials, and that's a huge space for innovation, and really the vibrational level, sort of the motions, watching the motions of atoms, is really where you can actually engineer and design more sustainable materials, but also understand how nature works. And when you look at this level and you live in that scale as a human, as a scientist, for many decades, I think they become indistinguishable. And so when you were introducing this, actually, I kind of had to remind myself that's how the world usually sees the different entities. To me, it looks different because when you look at this nanoscale world, and so the idea of representing this in an accessible way to the human senses, like sound or video or images, I think is very powerful, because it allows us to use the brain that we have in a creative way, right? So when you think about solving a problem like protein design or creating new life forms, nature speaks this incredible language of how bacteria, mold, or humans or whatever are created, or even the self-assembly of rocks. They actually are kind of a living system as well. They can interact with the environment. They can respond. They can do computing steps, if you wish, by responding. And so when you think about these various steps and you want to really integrate them in a description, it's a new language. And that's something that I've always been fascinated by Jenna's work, because she looks at language and the interpretation through different lenses. And that's very important for the materials that make life, like proteins. So we've actually used this method, and you can read about this in some of the published work we have. We use this musical representation of proteins actually to create new proteins and then make them in the laboratory. So you can really begin to kind of imagine that the creative outlet, or the part of our brain that can create melodies and rhythms, we can not only listen to these proteins like you've heard in a little piece, but you can actually create your own compositions and translate that back into a material, so you can really transcend the different manifestations. The other one thing I wanted to mention also, since you mentioned in the beginning, you mentioned a lot of the New Nature presentation had to do with climate, and I wanted to highlight again that the reason why these molecules are dancing and moving, and the reason why they make sound, is the temperature. And so when you think about changing temperatures, and actually thinking about going from an Arctic climate to the very, very warm climate, hot days, you can actually see these changes, very subtle changes, like mutations. You can hear slight changes in the temperature as well in the way molecules behave. So that's another angle to actually visualizing potentially how climate change affects life of molecules at a very fundamental level, and you can hear that. So I know people have done sonifications of the temperature rise, right? That's a very direct visual that you can then hear, but you can also hear the indirect. You can actually hear how these patterns of water waves basically change as the temperature changes ever so slightly.
It reminds me of another, oh, sorry, Jenna, go ahead.
Just a small comment that I thought it was really interesting what Markus pointed out before in his presentation about this, how, I'm not sure if this is exactly how you put it, but how human-made machinery and natural machinery are indistinguishable on nanoscale, still
Right.
Just to come back to this question of what is living.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think also the different sort of registers, with the archiving that you're doing, or for example, what you just said, Markus, about climate change, it reminds me of another artist that actually Jenna and I have both been working with, Cécilia Tolas, who is collecting and synthesizing smell molecules, and she makes accessible on a sensorial level the smell of a certain place at a certain time, but also in the future, if one went back to that same location to collect molecules, one could also compare and actually see how the environment has changed, how pollution has changed, etc. What I'm also thinking of in terms of, making or giving a voice to something else, I'm wondering about, the anthropocentrism that's inherent in that act. And I wonder if you encounter this both in your work, Jenna, as well as Markus, in the conversations with your colleagues, because I think on the one hand, it's a political act in a way that, Jacques Rancière would write about I have a quote here that I came to think of: "The dream of a suitable political work of art is in fact the dream of disrupting the relationship between the visible, the sayable, and the thinkable without having to use the terms of a message as a vehicle." So, how to change the relationship between that which is known and that which is unknown, that which is sayable or thinkable at any given time, but also without replicating or using even the same structures from a previous system that one may want to get out of. So I'm wondering about applying also some human, because in the end, we, the three of us talking here at least, are to some extent or percentage human. So how do we get beyond the inherent anthropocentrism in the tools that we create, even to give a voice to molecules, to a jellyfish, if at all?
That's always the difficult task, because of course we're stuck with language. I've really tried to somehow break language apart, or try to approach it like this, and also use these sorts of again you could say, or anthropocentrism is inevitable, again working with machines because they're built by humans, but somehow try to also sort of, by using, for example, neural networks, or like this kind of medium mediator in the process, by trying to loop in these other, like the movements of bacteria, or the types of information that maybe is a bit unusual. I'm hoping that there's like there would be, for example, in these experiments with machines and bacteria, that there would be like this possibility of also like the computers getting in touch with this like non-human world in some way, shape or form, and also sort of us understanding their non-human condition, for example. So I guess one answer is to kind of try to distantiate myself in the process by using, for example, some machinic process.
Actually, yeah, in the exhibition that we did together here, I remember you were also saying that, you know, or posing the question how to approach machines on their own terms. And
Yeah.
I think that's really interesting, not to try and adjust our brains to the way that, or not to try to adjust machines necessarily only to the way that we are thinking and feeling, but also to consider machines and their own terms and conditions.
Yeah, actually, and I mean, this is a great, great discussion, because I didn't mention this, but when you can listen to these molecules and you know, and structures and look at the language, and I actually think that, you know, we are the, you know, third-party observer, but nature itself uses this language of time-dependent phenomena, basically oscillatory phenomena, very intensely. So I was working a couple of years ago on the study of creation of blood vessels in the human body, and it's actually regulated by a spectrum of different oscillatory frequencies by which molecules vibrate and are secreted by the cells. So in other words, when the blood vessel forms, it the way cells communicate to actually build these blood vessels is done in an oscillatory time-dependent framework where the communication happens in this innate language. So you know, when you were talking about this, I just realized this, you know, really is there's plenty of evidence in nature and in the living world as we understand it today, that these motions, these repeated motions, are actually used as the internal language. They don't require the human intervention. So what you could do, for instance, if you were to you know, take the human perception, human representation out of the equation, you could actually feed back signals into the living world. And I'm just looking here at my petri dishes. I have some insects here that I'm working with that I'm feeding these signals from the nanoscale to try to understand whether a spider or you know, a wasp or an ant will actually respond, and in what way, to signals from the nanoscale, right? So it will respond, we know that, to signals from its own species. That's how these insects communicate. They have these antennae that kind of, they sense vibrations. But what if you feed information from another organism, right? So it really is kind of taking the human out of the equation. We're just feeding information. We're using some technology to do that, of course, but I think that's sort of the interspecies communication that I'm also really interested in. And especially what kind of materialization that results into. In other words, if you have an animal or an insect that creates material, like a spider will create a web, right? Or an ant will build a structure. And how is that structure that creates, you know, informed or influenced by the vibration here? It's just like for us, you know, we make the sound and make that sound back into a protein that we have in the laboratory. You know, can we use the animal only, right, to affect what it creates?
Mm-hmm. And you also, yeah, I guess the multitude of things that exist around us and even within us also put into question the anthropocentrism that we touched upon earlier, but also the idea of consciousness, or that consciousness is something that is entirely tied to one entity, or that even guarantees the existence of the self. I'm thinking of literary and post-human scholar Catherine Hales, who was talking about consciousness, and also speaking about posthumanism, and not only in terms of, you know, what that means for our bodies, but also what that means for consciousness. And she referred to posthumans as also a post-conscious subject. And I'm wondering about that in terms of the, you know, vibrations of molecules and interspecies communications that leave the human out of the equation and so on. So what does it actually mean for us and for our own position, and also in terms of consciousness, if we dare go into that direction?
Well,
We could also move on to other questions.
Somehow like a huge question.
I just wonder about, if we're not the only ones, or if, we're co-composed of bacteria and so on, what does that actually mean in terms of the Western humanist subject and the way that we conceive of our own selves and our sense of agency?
Yeah, at least I already feel that, for example, the bacteria, like the Bacillus subtilis bacteria, are already speaking to us, that they're already in our gut brain and they're affecting our thoughts and emotions. So in some sense that that language, that bacterial language exists and maybe somehow communicated by the human one as well. Yeah, and I guess with kind of very central to my work and thinking is this idea of being that the world is not a closed jar but an open ecosystem, and it's always changing, and similarly we're always part and parcel of our environment, and it's like this kind of we're not this Cartesian closed entity, that also like what is human could be another question next to what is life in the realm of these big questions.
Yeah, I mean, maybe following up on this, I think that what I've learned from this is that the human, how small of a part the human-centric perception really is. I don't know if it answers fully your question, but I look at this from my perspective. I see that, what we understand as being governed by certain rules at the macroscopic level, largely, that we experience. When you look at the nano level, you see an entirely different world, and you see how much more there is other than what we have kind of created in our framework. So I think there's a lot out there, and it's humbling. So that's probably the key thing. When we study a variety of different materials, a lot of natural materials, a lot of molecules, and understanding how they transcend across different representations. And it's fascinating how much is in there, and how very few people actually look into these things. And that's one of the goals that I have, is actually making these constructs accessible to a broad audience to appreciate. I mean, maybe if some of you have taken away today how molecules really look like and how they can actually hear them, that's a big deal, because now you begin to understand the world isn't static, right, at the nanoscale. It's continuously moving, and it's actually very flexible, right? And so it's incredible how strength emerges at the macro level from these very squishy objects like molecules in that sense. So I think it's very humbling, and I think the framework for how these, I was just looking at some of the Q&A questions. I think the framework by which we want to control matter and understand matter. Yeah, I think a lot of engineering has been done really, working against the forces of nature, because we just use an enormous amount of energy, let's say, to break certain chemical bonds and form very strong ones, which are incompatible with the way nature creates proteins, for instance. And what I have learned is that if we can make materials, with very high levels of strength and functionality that actually follow similar building principles as nature has created, and that's what we call biologically inspired engineering or bio-inspired design. And that involves a lot of times a lot more sustainable technologies, of course, at the end, because we're not working against nature. We're beginning to actually speak the language of nature. And that is, I think, very humbling, in a sense that for all these technological achievements we have created, there's an enormous amount of potential out there, especially at the nano scale, that we haven't even tapped into yet, but yet that nature has worked with for actually a couple of billions of years. And so I always, when I look at publications, like humans have created nanotubes, okay, or created these nanoscopic objects. Well, we know that nature has utilized nanotechnology for billions of years, right? So we're kind of discovering what nature has created, but we're putting it in a different framework. So I think that's a very exciting angle. I work a lot on sustainability themes, and that is really what we're looking at in terms of how we're using these insights, and that we can begin to build with nature and create sustainable materials and technologies, and utilize sort of this incredible universe at the nano level that we have available.
And,
Great,
not
thank
to
you.
mention all the communication and collaboration that goes on inside our bodies to sustain us that we have no idea of.
Mhm. I would like for us to move on to some of the questions that are coming in, and I will read them out for us. Here's one question by Caroline Jones. Jenna is clear about decisions she is making to instruct the algorithm to generate sound calligraphy. I'm still a little confused by Markus's statement that the rhythms and sonorities are generated by these molecules. What decisions are encoded in the algorithms to express, in time and sonic vibration, an image of a spatialized folding pattern in protein? How is space converted to time and rhythm?
Yeah. So, I can only give a brief answer, but I'm happy to talk more about it offline and so on. But because it would take a long time to explain. But basically, in a nutshell, so when you look at these molecules, as I've shown, the first movie showed just the actual motion of the molecule. In the second movie, I looked at one particular mode. We call it mode of deformation, which is kind of like a mode in a sonic wave where you have multiple frequencies overlaid. So we can use algorithms to extract quantum mechanically what are these modes of these unit operations of motions in a molecule, and they together as an ensemble create the sound of the molecule. And since the molecule has, I'm trying to keep it brief because I don't want to go too long, but basically the molecule has different levels of structure, of hierarchy, we call them. You can see this if you think about a molecule, it has an atom. There are groups of atoms, and there are groups of atoms, right? So there's this hierarchy of structure. And if you look at this, you can find, in cells or in materials like silk or in collagen or in bone, you can find 7, 10 levels of hierarchy. So each level of hierarchy has a unique set of vibrations associated with them, a unique sound. And so as you explore the structure like a three-dimensional folded protein, you have the amino acid building blocks, you have the sequence, and you have the geometric folding of this molecule. And I think I know why you're asking, because it actually relates very closely to language in the sense that we have the primary sequence of how the amino acids are arranged through the DNA code. The folding creates a three-dimensional pattern. The three-dimensional pattern is resembled in the sound almost like creating similarity or closeness by superimposing the sound. So in other words, when you imagine having a fold of a protein, like imagine having a straight rope. I don't have actually anything to show you. A spoon, I have a spoon. Let's say I have a spoon, it's straight. I go from one end to the other. Now, if I were to bend the spoon onto itself, I'm going to have a folding process. So now as I watch different regions of the spoon, I'm going to hear not a single tone, I hear a superposition of two tones, and actually, potentially an array of many different tones and melodies, as if you have a complicated three-dimensional molecule like a protein. So this coding is a physics-based coding. So in this work, I try to really follow the physics of how the vibrations actually are generated and how they spatially localize, which then creates a superposition of the different timbres or tones. And the reason why this is done that way is so that we can go reverse the process. We can go the other way around. So I want to be able to not only create a sonified representation of a protein, but also want to be able to take existing sound and make that back into a protein structure or three-dimensional structure. So I can go both ways reversibly. So that's essentially the process. I hope that answered the question partly. There's more details to this, but that is in a nutshell how this works. And so I don't have this here, but I have an example actually how I show the hierarchical buildup of sound or music and the hierarchical buildup of protein, and I have a side-by-side comparison of the two, and you can really see, you can very clearly see, or hear and see how you go from a single sine wave, or basically you can actually start by noise, and you can begin to filter out a single sine wave, and then creating superpositions of sine waves to create particular timbres, create harmonies, create melodies, and the concept of counterpoint actually is what we have discovered in this process, which is a musical theoretical concept, has been utilized, essentially is encoded in the structure of proteins itself because of the way they fold. And that is something that I also have been very interested in, is to see whether the reverse mapping, not from these weird sounding protein compositions, which are basically the nanoscopic sounds, but whether we can actually learn something about us as humans from what we have inadvertently created. When a human sits on a piano and writes, counterpoint melodies, we're coding information. Where does that come from? Well, one argument that we've made in our papers is this coding actually comes from the physical structure of our brain, because we are really merely matter, right? And this comes back to the question earlier about what is life and not. We're just basically a bunch of cells or molecules that are playing in concert in our brain, creating thoughts and instructing our fingers or pens to write notes. And so what we have hypothesized is that the reason why human created music and from very different cultures, using overlays of structure and the way nature creates materials, the way materials are created and reflected in nature, have very similar structures. And the reason for that is essentially that anything we create is really a mirror image of ourselves. We draw ourselves as paintings or reflections of ourselves, abstractions of that, and music and sound is really nothing different. We basically paint ourselves in that space. Now, the interest I have in sound is that it's a very abstract way of representing structure, right? So unlike a human trying to draw a face or a tree or a piece of wood, in sound we're really far removed from an association of a particular note or instrument or rhythm with a particular thing, right? It's very abstract. And so we think that this very, very deep abstraction actually is something that we can utilize to understand more about ourselves. And so we have these, hundreds and thousands of years of history of recordings of, written music that we can analyze to really understand what kind of structures have been represented in there that might be structures that we see inside our bodies or inside our brains or inside our heart muscles or whatever.
Funny, this is not so far away actually from some new age ideas of connectedness or even psychedelia, and like fractals and so on. But I'll read out another question from our audience, from Julie N. Aibais. Hi, thank you for this fascinating talk. I was wondering what career educational path you'd all taken. I studied biology and fine arts in undergrad, and I'm finding it quite challenging to find a way of reconciling both of these subjects at the graduate level, at least within traditional academic paths. Yeah, I guess that is quite difficult unless you're, there are some, I guess, areas within art where you can actually work together with researchers from other fields. Through collaborations such as this one between Jenna and Markus, for instance.
And I can mention that because my background is in media arts and also media studies, like the history of digital media. So I actually come from that field, like the field of media and technology more, maybe computation. But then because I was always like science fiction fan and into the concept of wetware. So next to software and hardware, this idea of some sort of biological computers that could be the human brain or could be the slime mold or something else, and that really, took me to the path of being interested in biological processes. And then I was just really lucky to be able to take part in residencies and sort of collaborative programs where I could actually learn a bit more about that field. So just to mention that actually I'm a total amateur when it comes to biology.
Yeah, and it's very true that you really, if you follow a traditional path or traditional, places, this kind of work's very difficult to do because it really transcends. I think in the introduction, I think Sandra was the one. Sorry if I don't remember correctly. I think she said she talked about the disciplines and transcending the disciplines. And I think you need the right community or environment to be able to do that. At MIT, we have a place where we really have no boundaries. Between what science is, what art is, what engineering is, and beyond that, humanities. And we don't always achieve that goal perfectly, but we really strive to be to really push these boundaries and CAST in particular, which is where, you know, I met Jenna, and I've been working with CAST for a number of years, is just this, you know, amazing place where you can actually explore a lot of these, you know, crazy ideas, you know, and but it really, yeah, I think it requires the right place where people appreciate, you know, crossing boundaries and actually going in the wrong direction a lot of times. And I, you know, I want to say, you know, at MIT we have amazing people that come here, like Jenna and other resident artists, but also we have amazing students and postdocs, which are, which really themselves come to MIT without these traditional boundaries of disciplines. And so I find that very natural for myself. I've always found it very natural. I worked with both science and music for actually ever since I can remember. I've been interested in both. And I've always been interested in crossing the boundaries. And, you know, when I was growing up as a, you know, going to college and, you know, getting my PhD, that is very difficult to do because you really can't conventionally do that. But, you know, once being at MIT, faculty at MIT, I actually had the space, you know, enabled by CAST and organizations like this to explore these, and it's extremely rewarding and exciting. And so, yeah, it requires, you know, the right kind of institutions, I guess, that support this kind of work. But there are around the world, and, you know, what you're doing here with New Nature is exciting. So there are more and more places that actually provide a forum for this kind of thinking. And actually, Stefanie, you brought up the New Age and its connection. I mean, I see a lot of these, you know, the science actually is beginning to, I think, discover a lot of these connections that came maybe intuitively, right, from non-traditional or say controversial, like Jenna said, controversial ideas. They're still controversial in a lot of places. I think if you were to go, you know, if I present this work at a conference, a scientific conference, I have to maybe take a little different angle in explaining it. But I try to be very honest and straightforward whenever I talk about it. But I do get questions, and so I think you just have to keep, you know, pushing your path. I think whoever asked this question, I think, is not on a memo, but you know, if this is something you're intrigued by, I would, you know, just keep exploring it. I think today there's a much better forum than there was maybe 10 or 20 years ago with the internet, with all the negative things it brings also, but there's an opportunity to connect with people around the world that you can discuss with. And you're not confined by your geographic location or the access to papers. I mean, you can find a lot of stuff online and talk to a lot of people and have conversations, which I think makes it easier than ever to really cross these boundaries.
Absolutely. And I think there's also something to be said about, you know, we're all three of us working on art science collaborations in one way or the other, but, you know, other forms of knowledge that are not considered scientific. And what you were saying, Markus, in some more maybe controversial fields from which knowledge comes or, you know, is brought to then more traditional fields of science. I think that's becoming more and more important to also look into, you know, ancestral forms of knowing, for example, and, you know, knowledge that has been there for a very long time, but maybe was lost or maybe was ignored for a while, and, you know, which is nevertheless very legit. So how to actually expand that idea of art, science, technology to, you know, other forms of knowing, more traditional forms of knowing, perhaps of plants and so on. I will read one more question, and I'm not entirely sure how much time we still have, but here's one from Rachel Bernstein. I hear a lot of ideas related to the brands of feminist theory and science technology studies called new materialism here, such as giving voice to matter, organic and inorganic. One criticism of new materialism is that it distracts away from the theme of power. Are we giving molecules a voice here, or are we simply harnessing and exploiting this more? Are funding agencies hoping this will increase our control of nature, or is this a genuine opportunity to relinquish some human control? Can you say more about the ways in which this is political work?
Can I quickly, because I tried to answer this earlier already with the focus on sustainability. I think the question came in before I talked about this, but that's
okay.
my angle to this. I think, you know, you can take this in many different ways. Of course, some entity might look at the AI algorithms as a way of controlling, you know, matter in a way. I would put it in that way that by understanding really how nature works, we have this really big space of design that if we choose to do that, I mean, that's the question, whether we choose to go that path, but if we choose to go that path, we can do a lot of engineering in a much less energy intensive, much less carbon intensive way. yet achieve functions that are probably better than what we can do today. And I think Jenna's work on using these really interesting biological organisms as a computing unit and then creating, extracting their language is fascinating, because it really points to utilizing something that's been in nature for probably billions of years, I assume, these kind of organisms. Yet we haven't used these. We created our own compute algorithms out of silicon, which try to mimic some of the things nature does in our brain. And we're beginning to go back to that. So I think there's a big shift. Neuromorphic computing is something that some might have heard of as well, as kind of building computers more like the human brain. Whether that's a good or bad idea, it's a separate discussion. But there is, even in building computers themselves, a movement into, moving into looking to nature and understanding how nature creates computers, basically, that process input and output. So I hope that answered part of that question. And the politics of this is whatever, I think we as a society will choose to do with it, right? If we choose to, weaponize, let's say, AI, it can lead to terrible outcomes. If we choose to use AI for creating sustainable materials to build safe infrastructure, that's a great solution. So really, it's upon all of us, I think, to make the right choices collectively.
And definitely I understand from the question also that I guess it's this kind of rhetoric of giving a voice is difficult, because of course you can only do so much, and from this kind of anthropocentric perspective, even if you try to avoid it, but and I always also am thinking about this kind of working with these more than human life forms, like how much is it working with or using these forms. Of course, it's the difficulty of communication again comes to play, like what can you agree on when you don't share a language with these organisms. But at the same time, the work seeks to point to these topics, kind of bring up certain forces and organisms that really like and also machines that kind of make us who we are, or make our are the infrastructure of our lives in some way, and just to kind of point that out, and also the politics therein, that of course when it's about machines, there's quite often corporations involved, there's like certain benefits involved, and I think as an artist, I kind of strive to also point these aspects out, and just kind of bring up these relationships from an angle that I feel is like right. Yeah, so it's kind of communication.
I'm also thinking about, there's a question here that unfortunately we don't have so much more time, so we can't answer it directly, maybe just tangential to what you were saying in response to Rachel's question, and also with Daniel Schimbaum's question here about what is being communicated. I come to think of some feminist thinkers such as Vicky Kirby, for instance, who are considering the ways of undoing the separation between the real thing and its representation. And I think this is something that, is maybe not a way to give voice to something, but actually a way to consider that thing, whether that's a molecule or something else, in its own right and in its own way of being, its own otherness, perhaps, to the way that we're thinking and feeling as humans, and to also accept it as as that enigmatic other without exoticizing it in any way. But it's not there's not a solution as such or an answer, I think, but to reconsider this representation, that is necessarily separate from the thing that we're talking about. That is really at the core of that question, I believe. And I think this is also where art can help us, or music as part of art as well, can help us to create other forms of relating.
Can I quickly add to this?
Mm-hmm.
Really quick, we're at the end, but this is a great question. And one example I want to give is a lot of times when I talk about in longer talks about the protein-based music or molecular-based music, I always people say, oh yeah, now we're going to look at a toxin, like a poison, and it must sound terrible, or a virus must sound terrible. And they think sugar must sound, beautiful. And the lesson learned actually is that that's not necessarily the case, right? And in fact, it's other features of the way these molecules are constructed and how they function. And so you might have an object that is like a virus, COVID, for instance, has an incredibly beautiful structure. And when that is sonified, we recognize the really intricate design of this particular molecule or feature of the molecule. Whereas something that maybe we think might sound very beautiful doesn't sound beautiful at all. Right? So that is, I think, an example why I like to work with sound a lot, because it's truly you really go away from the very particular associations of an object, and actually the experiment is always when you talk to people about it, that they expect the wrong thing, and that's very interesting. And then it's a moment of actually learning that it's not what you thought it was that we associate with that thing.
Great, thank you. So I think this is a good moment to wrap up. We've talked for an hour and a half. I wanted to thank you, Jenna and Markus. This was really great. I hope we can continue the conversation in another way. And I'll hand back again to Samara so she can wrap up the panel. And thanks also to our audience and the questions.
Thank you both, and the audience.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, thank you. This was really wonderful conversation. Steffi, thank you for moderating so masterfully. And Jenna and Markus, thank you for your just like really mind-provoking contributions to this otherwise dreary Sunday. And thank you to Unidas and Juan Pedro for moderating, and for Goethe and to Sandra for co-curating this talk. I'm going to share some links in the chat. I hope you're able to engage with the rest of the public programming for New Nature. The whole theme really of this talk and of the project, it seems, has really turned around the idea of like listening and attuning to the world around us in new ways, and kind of paying heed to new ways of sensing and paying attention to the information that is not traditionally kind of accessible through traditional methods of knowing. And so the Shorts program and the New Nature Vitrine, which will be in the Flatiron District in Manhattan starting next week, really have beautiful works that are inviting kind of a new kind of immersive exploration of non-human subjects. And they include Jenna's work, Holobiont, so they're all free, and the links are online. So thank you all, and I wish you all a happy Sunday.